Hello everyone, my name is Chris Gabriel. I put up the public GitHub repo that this tutorial is based on, github.com /Denali49 /fabric-ca-k8s. Hope you enjoy this tutorial. What you'll learn in this tutorial is getting ready to deploy a Hyperledger Fabric Certificate Authority in the cloud. And we're going to practice doing that by using Minikube, which is a nice little local VM that Kubernetes puts out. And what we'll do is we will deploy a persistent volume claim, a persistent volume storage, we'll provision storage, and then we will actually run a deployment against the VM where we deploy a Hyperledger Fabric Certificate Authority. And then we will interact with it by assigning, registering and enrolling identities, and then modifying those identities and getting you familiar with the commands that are listed in the Hyperledger Fabric documentation for the Certificate Authority. So I hope you enjoy this tutorial, and let's get started. Okay, so we want to deploy a Fabric Certificate Authority on Kubernetes so that we don't have to use cryptogen anymore. Some of the key concepts around this are that we're using Kubernetes, Docker, and the Fabric CA server and client, and the membership service provider. Some of the versioning is listed here so that you know what environment was used when this tutorial was set up. Of course, you're going to want to clone the repository to your local machine before you get started, and as a reminder, you'll have to stay in the same directory when you execute these commands. Next, if you have Docker desktop already running, you can use that to enable Kubernetes through the preferences, but if not, you can install Minikube, and the Kubernetes website has very good instructions for doing that. I've already run Minikube and checked it on my local machine, as you can see on the right-hand pane, but you can run Minikube start, and you should see a similar output on your local environment. Of course, your cluster IP will be different. So we verified that Minikube is running, and the next thing that we want to do is we want to set up our persistent volume claim. So we'll run the kube control apply -f for the setup PVC YAML file, and then we'll check that by running kube control get PVC to make sure that that persistent volume claim is bound and ready to go. Make sure that you don't delete your persistent volume claim until you're completely ready to be done, otherwise your data will not be persisted. Next, we'll provision our storage, our Redis storage, by applying that Kubernetes file, and then we will run kube control get pod to check the status of that. The container is still creating. If we run that again and it's successful, there it's running. And so now what we're going to do is we are going to run the init job that will initialize the Fabric CA server, where we can get a Fabric CA server config.yaml file that we're going to modify some settings in, and then we will interact with the server. The first thing that we need to do upon completion of that is make sure that our job completes, and then we want to copy the configuration file for the server from the container into our local machine. When we run that command, the kube control copy command, note the convention, you'll see that the config file pops up in your local environment, and we can edit it. And in this particular case, we're going to edit the CSR, the certificate signing request section of that. By default, that section has North Carolina for the state, and it has Hyperledger for the organization and Fabric for the organizational unit. In this case, we are going to make those changes, and we're going to change North Carolina to Texas. So go ahead and make that configuration change. And then for the organization, we're going to change Hyperledger to Hyperchain. And then the OU we're going to change from Fabric. Go ahead and change that to Energy. Make sure that you save this file right now by Control-S or Command-S, because we need it saved before we run the reverse of the kube control copy command to copy it from our local machine back into the container directory. where we got it to begin with. Next, we're going to exec into that pod, and we're going to delete the ca-cert.pem in the MSP folder directory. And the reason that we want to do this is because when we start the Fabric CA server, we want it to read in our config. So now we're going to apply the Fabric CA server start deployment. First we initted it, but this is the actual start command. When this container starts, we'll run kubectl get pods to check the status of it. And it's up and running, which is good. And so now we're going to want to fully copy that command or that pod name. So highlight that and hit Control C because we're going to use it in the next step. We're going to get logs by pasting that in there by kubectl logs and then pasting the full pod name in there. And as you can see, our Fabric CA server successfully started. And if we scroll up near the top of the output, we'll see that on the server configuration, our changes from the config file that we just modified are indeed reflected there. Texas, Hyperchain, and Energy. That's for the server side. The client side will still have the old values in it. Now what we're going to do is we are going to exec into the Fabric CA server container, and we're going to start running commands against the Fabric CA server with the Fabric CA client. And this is how we will register and enroll identities. And it's important to note that the first identity that we enroll has already been registered by virtue of being included in the Fabric CA server configuration file. So there won't be any need to register the CA admin because that has already been done. It was in the config file. But all of the other identities following, we will have to register them first and then enroll them second. So now that we have exported our Fabric CA client home variable to the CA admin folder and then enrolled it, that's where the certs were stored. Make note of the stored pathing there at the bottom of that output. That's where the certificates are stored. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to register a org admin, an organization peer node, and a user. And at the bottom you can see that we successfully completed the org admin as it outputs the password. We've successfully registered the org1 peer1 identity and then the user identity for org1. Now that we have that done, we need to register, enroll, because we've already registered them. So now we need to re-export the Fabric CA client home into the MSP folders of those three respective identities. So that's going to change with each one. This one will be pointed at peer 1. We'll enroll peer 1 and get the certificates. Now we need to point it at the user MSP folder with an export, and then we will enroll the user, and that cert gets stored in that path that we pointed the export at. Now if we run Fabric Identity List, we're going to get an error. And that is intentional because the last export we did was for the user ID, which does not have authority or for permissions to run these commands. So if we re-export to point to the admin cert and run Fabric CA Client Identity List, it in fact works. And we see the listing of the CA admin, the org admin, the peer node identification, and the user ID. Now those don't have any affiliations with them. So let's change that by modifying with a Fabric CA Client Identity Modify command, and we'll associate those with org1. And if we list the identity just for the org1 admin, we can see that in fact it has been affiliated with org1. Now we will do the same thing for the org1 peer 1 identification. That identity will now be affiliated with org1 after that modify command. If you list it out, you see there the org1 affiliation. Now we want to do the same thing with the user. And in fact, the user is now affiliated with Org 1, Department 1 as that output. So there is another thing that we can check to make sure that our Fabric CA server config.yaml file did in fact get modified. If we run the Fabric CA client certificate list against an identity that we just configured, and in this case we will list the user identity, you can see that the server side does in fact, the issuer was the state is Texas, the organization is Hyperchain, and the OU is Energy. On the client side, however, it's the way it was originally configured because we did not modify the client side configuration. So congratulations, you've successfully set this up, and you're not going to have to use Cryptogen anymore because you can now run your own. To clean this up, just type exit to get out of the running container, and then type minikube delete to fully delete everything and clean up. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial.